Fletcher Dane received the email on a Tuesday afternoon in October, between a site inspection report and a conference call with the Army Corps of Engineers. The sender was claudia.ashton@gmail.com, a name he hadn't looked at in 6 years. He sat back in his chair and read it twice, then once more. Not because the words were complicated. They weren't. The message was clean, polite, 3 sentences long. Claudia Ashton and Bryce Harmon cordially requested his presence at their wedding celebration at Briarwood Estate in Charleston, South Carolina. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the digital card. "It would be good to see you again, Fletcher. No hard feelings, I hope." No hard feelings. Fletcher set his phone face down on the desk and looked out the window at the Nashville skyline for a long moment. From down the hall, he could hear the particular sound of Willa attempting to read aloud, slow, deliberate, sounding out each syllable with the deep concentration only a 6-year-old could apply to a single page. "Dad," she called, "what does extraordinary mean?" "Something better than ordinary," he called back. A pause. "Am I extraordinary?" "Yeah," he said, "you are." He picked the phone back up and looked at the email again. Willa was his in every way that counted. Her mother, Rebecca, had been a nurse he'd dated for 8 months after Claudia left. Not a grand love story, more a quiet comfort between 2 people who were both healing from something they hadn't fully named yet. When Rebecca died of aggressive ovarian cancer 2 years after Willa was born, Fletcher became the only parent Willa had ever really known. He didn't talk about it much. There wasn't much to say. She was his and he was hers, and that was the whole of it. He typed a reply to Claudia's email. "Thank you for the invitation. We'll be there." 6 years earlier, Fletcher Dane had been exactly the kind of man people call steady. A structural engineer, good at the quiet, load-bearing work of making sure things didn't fall apart. He and Claudia met through mutual friends when he was 29 and she was 27, recently accepted into a prestigious architecture graduate program, and burning with ambition the way certain people do in their late 20s. Bright, consuming, no peripheral vision. He loved that about her. He also didn't fully understand what it cost him until later. While Claudia moved through her program's demands, studio nights, review panels, competitions, internships with firms that required working twice as hard as the men around her, Fletcher held the perimeter. He picked up extra consulting hours to cover the gap when her stipend ran short. He learned to cook actual meals. He drove her to 6 a.m. presentations when her anxiety made it hard to focus on traffic. Once, when she was 3 weeks from final reviews and a software licensing fee came due that she hadn't budgeted for, Fletcher sold his grandfather's set of hand-machined drafting tools. Kept in their original leather case, the only thing the old man had left him, to cover the difference without mentioning it. Claudia never asked where the money came from. Fletcher never explained. The end of them didn't arrive with a fight. It arrived quietly on a Thursday evening, with Claudia sitting across from him at the kitchen table looking at him the way someone looks at a road they've decided not to take. "I don't think you understand what I need," she said. Fletcher asked what she meant. "I need someone who's going somewhere. You're good, Fletcher. You're really good, but good isn't always enough." He didn't argue. He didn't chase. He helped her carry 2 boxes of things to her car and stood in the driveway watching her drive away until the taillights disappeared. Then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark. Bryce Harmon entered Claudia's life 8 months after that at a design conference in Atlanta. He was everything Fletcher was not in the ways Claudia had decided mattered. Well-connected, commercially aggressive, the kind of man who dropped names the way other people dropped napkins. His development firm, Harmon Group, had fingers in commercial real estate across 6 southeastern states. Claudia didn't know, and Fletcher at the time had only just begun to suspect what was living underneath the surface of Bryce Harmon's empire. Fletcher found out by accident. A bridge project in Chattanooga 2019, his firm, then still small, still growing, was brought in as a third-party reviewer. The subtractor materials reports didn't add up. Load tolerances listed in the filings didn't match the materials actually used on site. It wasn't a billing error. It was systemic, deliberate, and when Fletcher pulled the thread, it unraveled far enough to connect to 3 separate Harmon Group developments. He filed reports, he made calls. He cooperated with a federal infrastructure review that he was asked not to discuss publicly. And then he stepped back and let the people whose job it was handle it. That was 4 years before the wedding invitation arrived in his inbox. Briarwood Estate sat on 12 acres outside Charleston like something assembled specifically to humble its guests. White columns, live oaks draped in Spanish moss, valet parkers in white gloves, the kind of wedding that didn't acknowledge a budget because acknowledging a budget would have been considered poor taste. Fletcher arrived in a dark gray SUV, Willa asleep against the window for the last 40 minutes of the drive. When the vehicle stopped at the main entrance, two men in dark suits who were not valet attendants stepped out of a second vehicle behind them. Quiet, professional, scanning the grounds with the trained efficiency of people who did this for a living. They were not there because Fletcher asked for them. They were there because after a federal contractor flag had been placed on his file 3 years earlier, following an anonymous threat tied to the Chattanooga investigation, his firm's legal counsel had insisted on it. Fletcher woke Willa gently. She blinked, looked at the estate, and said with absolute sincerity, "Is this a princess castle?" "More or less," he said. "Are we the princess?" He helped her out of the car. "We're something better. We're the guests who get to leave whenever we want." Willa seemed satisfied with this. Inside the estate's grand reception hall, Claudia stood near the terrace entrance in a gown that had probably cost more than Fletcher's first car. She was luminous. She was also, he noticed immediately, slightly too controlled. The particular stillness of someone performing composure instead of feeling it. She saw him cross the threshold. For just a moment before she recovered, something moved across her face that he recognized: uncertainty. She had expected a footnote. She got something she couldn't immediately classify. He found their table easily, table 11, near a service door beside the catering corridor, surrounded by people who had clearly also been invited out of obligation rather than affection. He sat down, loosened his collar slightly, and read Willa the dessert menu because she considered this a necessary ritual. "Can I have 2 of the little chocolate ones?" she asked. "1," he said. "1.5? You can't have half a chocolate thing." She thought about this seriously. "I could save half for later." "That's not how it works at parties." "I feel like it could be." He was still smiling at that when a man in an expensive tuxedo appeared beside the table. Bryce Harmon, taller than Fletcher expected, handsome in the way that required maintenance. He extended his hand with the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to working rooms. "Fletcher, right? Claudia's mentioned you. Glad you could make it." Fletcher shook his hand. "Congratulations." Bryce's eyes moved briefly toward the security personnel visible through the tall glass doors, then back to Fletcher. Something shifted in his expression, not quite recognition, not quite worry. Something suspended between the two. "Long drive?" Bryce asked. "From Nashville. Not bad." "Right," he smiled with his mouth. "Well, enjoy the evening." He walked away at a pace slightly faster than casual. Claudia found Fletcher during cocktail hour, while Willa was occupied beside a small fountain in the garden, attempting to count the coins at the bottom through the moving water. "She's beautiful," Claudia said, watching her. "She's everything," Fletcher said. Claudia looked at him carefully. He had changed, and she was trying to locate exactly how. He was quieter than she remembered. Not withdrawn, just more fully occupied by himself, the way people become when they've learned to carry their own weight without looking for relief in someone else's eyes. "You seem well," she said. "I am." "I heard your firm has grown." He nodded once, said nothing else. She hesitated, which was unusual for Claudia, who typically located her footing quickly. "I want you to know, I don't regret everything, what we had." Fletcher looked toward Willa, who had found a beetle on the fountain's rim, and was deeply absorbed in observing it. "Neither do I," he said honestly. "You were worth loving, that part was real." Something shifted at the edges of Claudia's composure. She opened her mouth to say something else, but Willa looked up from across the garden and waved with enormous enthusiasm, and the moment sealed itself quietly closed. The wedding dinner had been underway for 40 minutes when the estate's main entrance opened again. A woman walked in who made 3 of Bryce Harmon's business partners visibly straighten without appearing to consciously decide to do so. She was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the specific kind of authority that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. 2 federal aides flanked her, unobtrusive as furniture. Josephine Park was the Federal Infrastructure Integrity Commissioner. She had held that position for 11 years. She had been, Fletcher knew, quietly overseeing the completion of an investigation that had begun with a set of mismatched load calculations on a bridge in Chattanooga. She crossed the reception hall without looking at the bride or the groom and walked directly to table 11. "Fletcher," she said. He rose. "Commissioner." Willa looked up at the woman with enormous eyes. "Are you important?" she asked with complete sincerity. Josephine Park looked down at her, and something in her expression became briefly almost warm. "That depends very much on who you ask." "I'd ask my dad," Willa said seriously. "He usually knows." Fletcher placed a hand on Willa's shoulder gently. Commissioner Parks straightened and handed Fletcher a thin document wallet. The final review concluded this afternoon. The U.S. Attorney's Office has coordinated with Charleston. I thought you should hear it directly. Fletcher opened the wallet, read the first page, closed it. He looked toward the head table where Bryce sat beside Claudia, champagne in hand, watching this exchange with an expression that had moved past uncertainty into something that looked like the early stages of dread. "Thank you," Fletcher said. "Your reports were what made it actionable," Commissioner Parks said. 4 years of patience, that's not nothing. She left the way she came. Every eye in the room followed her out, then swung back toward table 11. The agents appeared at the grand entrance doors 4 minutes later. The lead man scanned the room with the particular efficiency of someone who had already identified his subject, then walked in a straight line toward the head table. Bryce Harmon saw them coming. He stood. He said something to Claudia. Fletcher couldn't hear what, and whatever it was made her set her champagne glass down very slowly, as if setting it down carefully might hold the moment in place. The arrest was not loud. It was exactly as quiet and inevitable as the collapse of something that was always going to fall. Bryce Harmon was escorted out through the same entrance where he'd greeted guests 3 hours earlier. The room dissolved into the particular chaos that happens when wealthy people understand, all at once, that they do not control the situation. Voices overlapped, chairs scraped back, phones emerged. Claudia sat at the head table, motionless in her wedding gown, while the world she had arranged around herself came undone in front of 300 witnesses. Fletcher watched her from across the room. He had expected maybe some small human vindication. What he actually felt was closer to sorrow, not for himself, for her. She had spent 6 years building her life around a man she never fully investigated because he looked like the answer to questions she'd been asking. He had tried once years ago to warn her indirectly, framing it as professional caution, suggesting she look carefully at Harmon Group's development partners, saying it the only way he knew how to say something he couldn't yet fully explain. She had taken it as bitterness from a man struggling to let go. He hadn't corrected her. He had no proof yet, only a pattern in the numbers and an engineer's instinct for things that didn't bear the weight they claimed to. Willa appeared beside him, tugging his sleeve. "Daddy, people are crying." "Yeah," he said. "Is it okay to cry at weddings?" "Usually for different reasons than this." She considered that. "Should we go home?" He looked at his daughter, at Willa, who had her mother's dark eyes and his grandmother's stubborn chin, who was 6 years old and had already lost more than some people lose in a lifetime, and who had arrived somehow at a steady, unguarded way of moving through the world that Fletcher privately considered the most impressive thing he'd ever witnessed. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, "let's go home." They were halfway to the exit when Claudia's voice came from behind him. "Fletcher." He stopped. Willa looked up at him. He gave her a quiet nod, "It's okay," and turned around. Claudia stood a few feet away, and she looked for the first time since he'd known her, like someone who had run out of performances to give. The gown, the venue, the 300 people. None of it was scaffolding anymore. "Did you know?" she asked. Her voice was level, barely. "I reported what I found to federal investigators 4 years ago," he said. "I didn't know when it would land or how far it would go." "You could have told me." "You were already involved with his firm. Your name was attached to his partner's legal team. If I had told you then, you would have been in the middle of an active investigation with no way out." He paused. "I made a choice." Claudia stared at him for a long moment. "You protected me," she said. Not a question, a realization arriving late, heavier for how long it had been in transit. He didn't answer directly. "I reported a safety violation. What happened after that wasn't mine to control." But they both understood what he meant. What he had chosen not to do, and why. What he had quietly absorbed on her behalf without telling her it was happening, the same way he'd covered a software fee without mentioning the drafting tools he'd sold to do it. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly. "Not just tonight, a long time ago." Fletcher looked at her steadily. "You were young, so was I. You deserved better than what I gave you." He nodded, not to dismiss her, but to receive it. "So did you," he said. "You just looked in the wrong direction for it." He touched Willa's shoulder. Willa said with complete seriousness, "I hope your night gets better," which made something in Claudia's expression break open a little. And then they were walking toward the door, and the cool October air of Charleston met them at the threshold. And behind them the sound of the wedding dissolving into something else entirely grew softer with every step. 3 months later, on a bright Saturday morning in January, Claudia drove to Nashville. She found Fletcher at a middle school gymnasium where Willa's class was presenting their science fair projects. Willa's display a hand-painted diagram explaining why bridges needed to be tested before they opened, stood slightly crooked at the edge of the table, held together with extra tape and complete conviction. Claudia sat down beside Fletcher in a folding chair and didn't say anything for a while. Willa presented her project to a passing judge with intense seriousness, gesturing at each section like a professor 3 times her age. She told the judge that her dad taught her about load-bearing walls, Claudia said finally. She asked me once why buildings don't fall over, Fletcher said. I might have gone too deep. Claudia smiled. It was smaller than her usual smiles, quieter, less constructed, more like an actual smile. I'm sorry, she said, for what I said when I left, about you not going anywhere. He watched Willa shake the judge's hand with excessive formality. I know, he said. I've been thinking about what I built my choices around, what I thought mattered. She folded her hands in her lap. I think I confused ambition with worth. I thought reaching further was the same thing as becoming more. I don't know when I started believing that. A pause. I saw what you had with Willa that night. Just watching you two from across the room, I hadn't felt. She stopped. I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say. You're saying you recognize it now, Fletcher said. That's not nothing. She nodded. Across the gym, Willa caught sight of Claudia and waved, then held up 3 fingers, 3rd highest ribbon. Claudia held up a thumbs up and Willa looked extremely satisfied and turned back to her project. She's going to be something, Claudia said. She already is, Fletcher said. They sat in the folding chairs for a while longer. Not as people with a shared future, not as enemies, but as 2 people who once meant something real to each other and had found their way, separately, slowly, at real cost, to something honest in themselves. When Willa came running across the gym with her yellow ribbon and a paper plate of cookies she'd negotiated from the refreshment table, she handed 1 cookie to Fletcher and 1 to Claudia without pausing, because in Willa's understanding of the world, people sitting together at your thing probably needed to be fed. Fletcher looked at the cookie in his hand, then at his daughter already describing the exact shade of yellow of her ribbon to anyone who would listen. Then at the flat January light coming through the gymnasium windows, clean and unhurried. Some things, he thought, take exactly as long as they need to.